Welcome back to International NCRP. I have been enjoying your discussions and hope that you will feel comfortable writing me emails directly to indicate specific interests and questions as we transition from my very quick introduction of what is happening with international NCRP at the elite international level as we transition towards the grassroots, community, intergroup, peace-building level. Now, your text Paving is a wonderful and rare collection showing you where these two worlds will occasionally overlap. And I appreciate that at times there is interactive, facilitative conflict resolution happening where representatives from the communities concerned come to the table with the elite, diplomats, government representatives, others, to negotiate ceasefires and other important agreements. But that is still far from the complex, in-depth peace building that must go on in all of these conflicts and countries in order to build peace that lasts. And this is not a course where I will spend much time talking about peace building apart from your assigned readings in my text and some of the activities. But I will reinforce briefly today before I turn to my PowerPoint lecture that a culture of peace, as defined by UNESCO and prominent peace scholars, requires working with all the complex dynamics of a community, a society. It includes the institutions, particularly the institutions of justice. It includes processes, how decisions are made, how authority is exercised. And so it's quite a long-term study. You get an introduction in our graduate program, but I encourage any of you with a more extended, passionate interest to consider acquainting yourself with nonviolence, for example. There are many case studies of how nonviolent resistance has been used to counter injustice, to counter power abuse, oppressive authority, pretty much case studies following the examples of Gandhi and Dr. King. We do not have the time to include that in this course, but I think you will find it rich study. Okay, as all other classes, I will be relying on a PowerPoint for the remainder of my lecture. Let's cut to that screen. What I will be doing today is finishing up some of my case study analysis of Jimmy Carter and his center's mediation work in Venezuela, and then starting to introduce facilitated dialogue, mediation, more inclusive participatory conflict resolution being used around the world today. Now, some of you have studied alternative dispute resolution, and so you're familiar with arbitration and other quasi-legal processes within NCRP. For those of you who have not yet studied alternative dispute resolution, this may be your introduction. Once again, I welcome questions. I'm going to try to quickly, briefly introduce some of what is happening internationally with ADR. Arbitration is very popular, especially in the commercial world. You would not see corporations and businesses doing what they are doing today around the world, particularly in the most corrupt societies where the judicial system is not even close to the judicial system that businesses and corporations rely on in the United States. They are creating their own legal processes and agreements through contract, selecting their own expert arbitrators, who makes a binding decision like a judge would make a binding decision, but because parties can select their experts, and they select them together. Sometimes it's a panel of 3 different experts. My arbitration experience there is one arbitrator. That arbitrator is expected to follow relevant laws. Now, this is fascinating on an international level, and this is not a class on international law, but you can imagine the complexity given that every nation state has its own laws. It's a quasi-legal proceeding, though, so arbitrators do not get the review that judges get. There is no appeal. There is very rare appeal. So if they don't follow the relevant laws, it might be difficult for the parties to do anything about that decision. Many times this is enough like a traditional legal proceeding that parties are represented by lawyers who make their arguments and make their cases in front of arbitrators. Conciliation is also very popular on the international level. And conciliation experts, John Paul Lederach is quite a famous name in peace building. They can make binding decisions if the parties request. This is your traditional shuttle diplomacy, what you saw with Jimmy Carter in the Camp David Accord, where the third party will meet individually with the parties and go back and forth, and then in an evaluative way will advise the parties about what they need to do. So when you hear conciliation, that is likely what is happening. Facilitated dialogue is much more like what you are studying in NCRP, particularly when you study mediation. It is a facilitated process where the mediator or the third-party facilitator seeks to foster effective communication and facilitate the development of creative options. And I'm quoting here from the text that Jimmy Carter's colleagues wrote and published after his time mediating in Venezuela. So you can look up this year and these authors if you want to learn more about that case study. Now, President Chavez started with conflict management, which I introduced last week. He wanted a government-controlled process. He wanted it in government offices rather than, some of you, those of you who've studied ethics with me, know that I do not believe in true neutrality. It's quite rare, but I will use their language at the moment. Rather than a neutral or impartial, safe, comfortable place for all parties, he demanded that the meetings happen in his offices. Well, he had an opposition, like many Latin countries, that was so fierce, so hostile, that the result was that many never came to the meeting. But certainly, even for those who were more collaborative, more willing to test the process, this solidified the existing deep mistrust. Now, he did invite outside facilitators. So he was not attempting to control entirely. But the risk at the elite international level, and you saw this recently with the Iranian negotiations, nuclear negotiations, is the role of the media. And on the flip side, if you have studied nonviolent resistance, in the shoes of Gandhi and Dr. King, you know that effective nonviolent resistance works hand in hand with potent media. So media can advance peace building and conflict resolution, but in many of these international conflicts, very hostile, intractable conflicts, media often derails the process. Rumors are spread. The rumor in this particular case study is that he received money. He was already part of corruption. There was a false rumor spread that in the elections that elected President Chavez, Carter was not an independent, impartial critic. He only praised. He took one party's side, and so he was partial. Part of the challenge at the international elite level, but also the more inclusive international process, is effectively countering propaganda and attempted sabotage. Now, I saw this most dramatically and intimately when I facilitated cross-ethnic dialogue with professionals from the Balkans during their war. The propaganda was so thick during that war that it was very difficult to find a more impartial, objective perspective being published on the web or in any other media. One of the ways that international players can effectively counter propaganda and attempted sabotage is to ensure that there is diverse representation and ratification with the stakeholders present. So you invite, in brief, your enemy, their representatives to the table so that you can have personal contact in trying to correct false gossip. And you give them an opportunity to problem solve with you around whatever their concerns. Ratification, for those of you who have not studied in theories of conflict with me, is, and for those of you who have, this is introduced in your last case study in Holding These Truths. Ratification is the process of representatives going to their communities, sharing with them what is happening in the conflict resolution process, and ensuring that their constituency backs and supports what they're doing. If someone is, for example, a government representative, they must go to the government leadership to ensure that they have government backing before they proceed with the process. So this is a typical process that happens with a complex society conflict resolution. By having diverse representation and ratification, there is the opportunity to broadly share accurate information in the conflict resolution process itself. Critically important. Prioritizing conflict resolution process design is more important at the international level than probably any other, except perhaps the community level, human relations, community relations level. Any place where you might have multicultural, multi-religious stakeholders. And Carter's team did not prioritize conflict resolution process design. They pressured the opposition to trust them, to participate. Not smart, and we all have, wisdom and regrets in hindsight, so please don't take this as a personal critique of Jimmy Carter and his team. I think they actually are doing some of the best work that we currently see in international conflict resolution. But as this case study demonstrates, there still is much room for improvement. They were impatient about and neglected process design. They jumped right into a very difficult discussion. And Jimmy Carter was a president of our country, so you can forgive him. He believes that world leaders will often listen to him as a former president of the United States. A little naive, I would say, given our current world situation and the fact that Jimmy Carter only lasted one term. But still, he had his successes with Camp David, and he expects world leaders to respect him. Now, this would have been a dominant approach, rather than a facilitative, inclusive, participatory approach. In a participatory, impartial conflict process, you do not pressure the parties to accept the mediator, to accept the mediator's influence, or to accept their lead in evaluation. Instead, the stakeholders, the parties themselves take the lead, and the mediator, facilitator is there to empower, support, and guide them. Now, you will be reading case study examples that I co-researched, wrote, and published with community members, mediators, and scholars from the Balkans, Cameroon, Nepal, and Ukraine. And Cameroon in particular, we will emphasize because it is such a powerful case study of success in designing optimal, inclusive, participatory, international process in the face of war and violence. I don't have as much information on Nepal. I first met a Nepali lawyer about 15 years ago at the University of Oslo, where I taught him multicultural conflict resolution. He went back to Nepal and started a widespread community transformation through embracing mediation as a vehicle for social justice. They have since ousted their monarchy and become a new democracy in the face of Maoist terrorist violence. It's a fascinating case study. I wish I had more information about what has happened the last 10 years or so. You might want to look into it. Now, Ukraine is certainly in the news, and you will see that I worked with a Ukrainian minority who was mediating in a community mediation center in Ukraine. There's a lot going on that can be a contemporary case study. So these are areas you might want to focus on throughout the course. What the participants evaluated as most important in a participatory international conflict resolution process was feeling comfortable. And this was research, if you've done the reading, you've read this. This was research of participants in cross-religious, tribe, ethnic process in these different parts of the world. So, you know, this is a multicultural research study, and all of these cultures and people said feeling comfortable, openly and honestly sharing was the most important part of their process. Now, the question is, and I'm asking it as a personal question, what do you need to feel comfortable openly and honestly disclosing sharing? Even in class this semester, what would you need to make that work? Now, the Venezuelan opposition, in contrast, did not feel comfortable openly and honestly sharing. They were trying to oust President Chavez, and to see his control, his domination of the process did not help. They also did not feel comfortable openly and honestly sharing when an external team, the Carter team, first intervened. I've given you some of the reasons. No one can mandate open, honest sharing and comfort with a process. My research, again, the research I just introduced, but also research since, and I think I've currently taught and worked with students and clients from about 80 different countries. I would say the most important criteria in my experience is that the external facilitator, mediator treat everyone equally. They are perceived as treating everyone equally. And there is an objective equal participation. So power sharing is the most important criteria. Now, I encourage, if any of you are considering trying to be a mediator in these types of conflicts, I'm going to encourage you to do some reflective practice throughout this course. And ask yourself, what world cultures are you prepared to treat equally with your own? Now, many human beings don't do this. They have not been raised to do this. Most human beings, and you can pick a number of different cultures, are raised by their families and communities to believe that they should be looking out for their own community, their own culture first. So treating other cultures equally can be challenging. Fortunately, some of my upbringing, I've mentioned, was with Norwegian-speaking recent immigrants to this country, and if there's a nation state in the world today that believes in treating people equally, it's Norway. And it's one of the reasons Norway is one of the only trusted nation states with mediating at the international level. Now, I know Norwegians, and I have been to Norway and lived there, taught there more than once. I know they are struggling with living this with their immigrants, primarily immigrants from Pakistan. They have this ideal, but it's not necessarily easy to live in practice. So I'm not saying that this is any type of perfect situation, but at least they have that general norm. And you, if you would ever study their royalty, their king, queen, the prince, you would see that they live as if they are the same as other Norwegian citizens. In fact, there is a shame and embarrassment about flaunting yourself, giving yourself too much attention. And then, of course, the other question, which is even more important, is what cultures would or might you struggle with treating equally? Now, I must say, since I spent the early part of the year with Arab people, Arab Christians primarily, in the West Bank, and I have worked with Israeli, Jewish, Palestinian dialogue for almost 20 years. I have discovered that many American evangelical Christians have a hard time imagining that I would be associating with Arab people. There is an enormous prejudice that I've confronted. And even my Jewish friends who might have a deep fear of the Arab world's relationship with Israel don't seem to have the same struggle. It's interesting to see. We need to all ask ourselves, all mediators working with cultures other than our own need to ask ourselves, do we have any bias, prejudice, or judgment about any culture or nation state? Critical reflective practice to help prepare with building trust. And we don't necessarily become aware of these biases and prejudice until we are working in the field and getting feedback from real people. Now, creativity, you will be reading, or you have just read, a chapter on NCRP and innovation creativity. I wanted to say very quickly, when I first started working with Israeli, Palestinian, Jewish dialogue, and I asked for ideas about peace building, I received several blank looks. Because many of us expect that someone will hand us a manual, a formula for proceeding in our day-to-day life, as if peace building can be equated with learning to use a computer. And it simply doesn't work that way. The people concerned with whatever conflict is happening need to be prepared to come together and be creative about what will build peace in their circumstances. Now, I have shared this in my theories class. I want to share it quickly here. The US research, this was my colleague's research in Denver years ago, a social work faculty. Research of those who have been violent, those who have physically attacked another, what they reported about the person they assaulted. They saw themselves as victims and saw in the person they assaulted cold disinterest, humiliation, and attack starting the conflict. It's important that we be aware that people in these conflicts around the world have these different perceptions and experiences. Okay, I will wrap up in a minute. For those of you who studied theories with me, you are familiar with complex systems analysis, particularly Lewis force field analysis. As you are starting to research your case studies and analyzing them in order to propose ideas for building peace, I would like you to revisit my lecture and identify what forces in that particular society are causing and driving violence, and what forces in the society are inhibiting and preventing violence, or you can flip that, reframe that to building peace.